Most casual students of Roman history are familiar with Julian the Apostate, the last pagan emperor, and assume that paganism in the Roman Empire must have died quietly in the years after his death. However, as is almost always the case, things were significantly more complicated than that. Due to archaeology, we now know that there were pockets of pagan practice in ostensibly Romanized Christian land until the 8th century. It is unfortunate that we can't flesh out the details of the lives and the beliefs of the rural pagan holdouts of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, but that does not mean that we are entirely without a good story which can serve as a last hurrah for ancient pagan practices. Today, we will move 3 decades past Julian's death and meet the Emperor Eugenius, who ruled from 392 to 394 CE and oversaw the last pagan revival which enjoyed the sanction of the Roman state. To understand Eugenius, his revival, and his conflict with Theodosius, the emperor in the East, we first need to establish a general context. Back in 378 CE, the Emperor Valens was defeated and killed at Adrianople, one of the worst military defeats in Roman history. Valens' nephew, Gratian, the Western Roman Emperor, appointed a nobleman named Theodosius to take up the throne of the East and restore order in conjunction with Gratian's trusted Frankish general, Arbogast. Theodosius achieved this task and restored order. However, to patch up the many holes left by the destruction of the Eastern field army at Adrianople, Theodosius had to recruit many barbarians to fill his ranks, including some of the men who fought on the other side at Adrianople. Some scholars have also speculated that Theodosius retained some of the units from the Western field army, which left the West weaker than it should have been over the next few decades. When Gratian fell into unpopularity and was murdered in 383 by the usurper Magnus Maximus, Theodosius marched east and avenged his benefactor in 388. He left Arbogast to aid Gratian's young half-brother Valentinian II in governing the West. Officially donning the purple at the age of 4 back in 375 along with Gratian, Valentinian II seems to have been something of a non-entity who never developed into a full-fledged ruler. Even after Valentinian achieved manhood, Arbogast controlled everything and answered only to Theodosius. Our sources disagree on whether the 21-year-old Valentinian II's death by hanging was suicide or murder at the hands of Arbogast, but at any rate, he was dead in 392, and with him perished the Valentinian dynasty, founded by his grandfather and namesake. Arbogast seems to have been taken aback by this development, and initially accepted the authority of Theodosius' son Arcadius, pictured here, as the emperor of the West. However, within a few months, the Frankish general changed his mind and had an imperial official named Eugenius declared emperor. Surprisingly, Theodosius did not declare war or register any strong objection, although subsequent events make it very likely that he was biding his time for an opportunity to remove Arbogast, who had just shown himself to be untrustworthy and power-hungry. Interestingly enough, Arcadius never did become emperor of the West, but rather succeeded to the throne in the East. Fun side note. We don't know all that much about Eugenius, which is generally the case with most short-lived emperors from the late imperial period. Eugenius was a former teacher of grammar and rhetoric who was an acquaintance of Arbogast. Due to his lack of military experience and low stature, it is hard to avoid drawing the conclusion that Arbogast was looking for a pliant figurehead with impeccable Roman breeding to serve as a front for his own rule, which would have been unacceptable to the Roman public if it were revealed publicly due to his Frankish origins. Eugenius was a professed Christian, but it seems possible that his attempts at courting pagan support may have led him to become pagan himself, although this is speculative and heavily colored by our sources, some of which are pagan and want to claim him, and others of which are adamantly Christian and served as positive press for Theodosius and Christianity. By 393, when relations between Theodosius and Eugenius had soured, Eugenius was looking to rouse support to his cause. The pagan historian Zosimus suggests that Eugenius and Arbogast, who apparently was a pagan, devised a scheme to promote a pagan revival. If true, this would seem to be an attempt to create a cause for the remaining pagans of Italy in the West, which was less heavily Christian than the East at this time, to rally around. However, it is also possible that the pagan revival occurred simply because Eugenius ended the policies banning pagan worship, and then Arbogast persuaded him to ride that wave to court pagan aristocrats and their coffers. For context, the Senate at Rome was still overwhelmingly and outspokenly pagan, and they were so influential in the city of Rome itself that the bishops of Rome went out of their way to avoid conflict with them on matters of religion during the entirety of the 4th century. Whatever the origins of the pagan revival, there were two key components of the movement. The first sign of Eugenius's endorsement of paganism was when he elevated the openly pagan scholar and senator Virius Nicomachus Flavianus, pictured here, to the position of Praetorian Prefect of Italy. Second, and apparently only at the insistence of Arbogast, Eugenius allowed for the restoration of the altar of victory at Rome, pictured previously, which had been removed by Gratian. In addition, Eugenius oversaw the reopening of other pagan temples. Unfortunately, our sources provide no indication of how the public reacted to these measures, and we have no way to know accurately what percentage of the population or the Roman army was pagan during the 390s. It is also very possible that Eugenius's so-called embrace of paganism was really just a restoration of tolerance and not much more, and that the extent of this revival has been massively blown out of proportion by our sources with their strong religious biases. At any rate, Theodosius used Eugenius's pagan revival as a pretext for launching a holy war to defend Christianity in the West. In accordance with treaties that he made in 382 and through diplomacy, Theodosius was able to secure the services of Visigoths, Alans, and Huns for his expedition. Theodosius marched overland from Constantinople to Italy, and Arbogast was determined to utilize the defensive advantages granted by the Julian Alps. Since Arbogast and Theodosius were equally seasoned commanders, this suggests that the Western army was a good deal weaker than the force that Theodosius was bringing to the conflict. When the two armies met near the river Frigidus on September 5th, 394, Theodosius put the Visigoths in his vanguard and launched a frontal assault. After a long struggle and after suffering heavy losses, Theodosius withdrew to his camp and prayed to God for deliverance, according to Christian sources. Arbogast had another force in the mountains and sent that force to hit Theodosius' camp while his army was in disarray. When they arrived, Theodosius was able to induce them to defect to his cause by use of a massive bribe. Reinforced by his enemies, Theodosius mounted a second frontal assault the next day on September 6th. This time, Arbogast positioned his troops in a strong defensive position, but a weather phenomenon peculiar to the Julian Alps made hash of this plan. The bora is a phenomenon which can cause cyclones of up to 60 miles per hour. Unfortunately for Eugenius's cause, the bora flew in the faces of his men, which was demoralizing and rendered the use of projectiles against Theodosius's advancing forces nearly impossible. Not surprisingly, when Theodosius won after such a weather event, Christian writers such as Augustine claim that this was an example of divine intervention. When their camp was overrun, Eugenius and Arbogast met their respective fates. Eugenius was captured and brought before Theodosius, where he begged for mercy. Unmoved, Theodosius had him decapitated and sent his severed head on a tour of Rome's provinces. The more rugged Arbogast escaped to the mountains and wandered about for a few days. Finally, realizing that he was ruined, Arbogast committed suicide in the tradition of the Roman nobility. In the years after Eugenius's defeat, the church in Rome started to assert itself and began its long transformation into the papacy, while paganism retreated further and further to the margins of society. While it seems very likely that some members of the elite continued to have pagan practices until at least the 6th century, they had to keep these beliefs hidden in order to avoid persecution and procure imperial favor. And now for some analysis. It seems very likely to me that Theodosius was eager to exaggerate the degree of Eugenius's pagan revival in order to distract the attention of the Roman elite away from the fact that he was using large numbers of barbarian troops to wage an unnecessary civil war against his fellow Romans. Further, as most modern scholars have concluded, the presence of large numbers of barbarian allies was almost certainly more significant than the weather in determining the outcome of this battle. Since he launched 2 frontal assaults on consecutive days and on rough terrain, it is hard to avoid thinking that Theodosius' army was anything other than greatly superior in numbers, and that this blunt application of force seemed logical given that apparent disparity. Further, one thing that scholars too often ignore is the fact that bribery played a vital role in this battle. Theodosius' ability to win over a large portion of Eugenius' army with a large bribe makes a lot of sense when you realize that about 3/4 of the empire's total wealth by this period resided in the east. Theodosius had been on the throne longer and was able to draw tax revenues from much richer lands than Eugenius. It is also possible to make other deductions from this defection to a defeated foe, but such speculations would be hard to prove or provide evidence for. Before we part company with Theodosius, it is also worth noting that his claim to the title The Great stems largely from his being a dedicated defender of Christianity and his status as the last Roman emperor to control both East and West. For Theodosius' supporters and successors, Eugenius needed to be a boogeyman and persecutor of Christians for their hero to not only be justified for waging a civil war, but to be an unambiguous hero of the empire. This was the first video in what I hope will become a long-running series about the fall of the Roman Empire and the transition to the period of the barbarian kingdoms of the early Middle Ages. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, I urge you to like, comment, and subscribe, and all that other fancy stuff that YouTubers like to say. I will have more content up soon. I was on vacation, but I managed to write a number of scripts, so I'll be performing and recording those over the next several days, so I could have a fairly productive period coming up here. In other news, I just hit 100 subscribers this morning, so I'm pretty happy about that, and I may do some sort of celebration video or run some sort of a question and answer video. That seems to be a thing that people do. Anyway, whatever. I'm Thersites the Historian. Stay tuned, and I'll put up more videos, just as you know how YouTube works with videos and subscriptions and all that fun shit. Anyway, goodbye.